Hello. And in this session, we're going to talk about what the Procurement Act does in relation to new procurement procedures and frameworks and dynamic markets. I'm Tim Kerr. I'm a partner at Ward Hattersley in the public sector team.
And I'm Patrick Saunders, an associate in the public sector team here at Ward Hattersley.
So, Patrick, you've got your work cut out, I think, in this one. As I understand it, the Act is introducing quite a few changes when it comes to procurement procedures and frameworks and these so-called dynamic markets. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's quite a lot to get through. And the first thing I'd probably pick up on is that new dynamic purchasing systems can no longer be set up after February 2025. And instead, they're going to be replaced by markets, as you mentioned. We'll come on to that in a bit. Aside from that, there's now only two main procurement procedures, a formalised direct award process, and also the introduction of open frameworks. I think in order to properly address these changes, the logical thing to do is to split it out into sections. So we'll start with going over the competitive tendering procedures. So that's your open and competitive flexible procedure. We'll then talk about the new direct award legislation. We'll talk about frameworks to include open frameworks. And then we'll come on to dynamic markets and the death of the DPS. I'm not going to talk about the various notices which are required to place a central digital platform because we're going to cover those in another podcast.
Yes, well, that sounds fair enough. We've got a lot to talk about. So, okay, that all sounds sensible to me. So we're going to start off looking at the open and the competitive flexible procedures. I can't even say it. You can hopefully talk about it.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
So what the Act has done is it's rationalised a lot of procedures. So it's rationalised the open procedure, restricted procedure, competitive procedure with negotiation, competitive dialogue procedure, innovation partnerships, and design contest options. I'm not going to speak from the regs into two options. They are the open procedure and the competitive flexible procedure. The open procedure is the only procedure now which has a prescribed form in the Act, and it's a single-stage process in which there's no restriction on the number of tenderers. It strongly resembles the old open procedure, but there are some important changes. The first, and in my view the most significant, is that the tendering period for this procedure has been reduced to 25 days, where tenders are submitted electronically, but it can also be further reduced to 10 days in either of two circumstances. One, that a qualifying planned procurement notice has been published, or two, in a state of urgency where any other minimum timescale is in fact out.
Those sound very short. Are those kind of set in stone, those timescales?
No, they're not. So these are the minimum periods, and there's no maximums within the Act. The Act does contain various factors which authorities need to have regard to. Again, there we go, have regard to. What's that in the Act?
Yeah.
When setting tendering periods. So, for example, that could be the complexity of the contract or the procurement objective of breaking down barriers for SMEs. Essentially, what the authority needs to do is ensure that suppliers have sufficient time to respond and to make sure that timescales are realistic and unlikely to result in delays should insufficient time be allowed at the outset. Aside from timescale changes, there's no requirement to set conditions of participation, which is called selection criteria. For an open procedure, and exclusion grounds must be considered prior to assessing tenders.
Excellent.
Finally, the terms of an open procedure may be modified up to the tender deadline. This can include changes to the requirement or specification, the conditions of participation, if applicable, and the award criteria. If a modification is made, it has to be communicated in writing at the time that the modification is made. And also the tender notice needs to be updated together with any other documentation affected. And it also needs to be republished. It will also usually be sensible to consider amending the tender deadlines, making a change that might, the suppliers may need more time to respond.
So there are now specific provisions in the Procurement Act, if I understand you right, that allow you to make those modifications.
Yes, absolutely.
I think you and I have advised many people in the past on whether or not you can make changes. Now, some actual specific rules that we can latch onto if we want to make that.
Absolutely,
yes. That's very useful. So, okay, actually, that all sounds fairly familiar. So, can we talk about competitive flexible procedure?
Yes, we can. And this is a bit of a create your own adventure process. Probably ages me a little bit, but there we are. And it replaces many of the more prescriptive procedures and allows creation of a bespoke procurement procedure using some of the tools which have previously been available to authorities. So these are things like negotiation and/or dialogue, all into a single procedure. This could be a multi-stage procedure, and examples available to authorities are they may limit the number of participants to the procedure. They could provide a refinement of award criteria, could limit the number of lots a supplier can be awarded or can bid for, and many, many more. There really are a huge number of options that authorities can work with. As always, the authority must have regard to procurement objectives, and they also need to meet procedural requirements, including timescales and transparency. There's also got to be, they have to ensure that the process is proportionate to the complexity and cost of the contract so that it won't deter suppliers. So, for example, designing a 5-stage process for the purchase of stationery supplies probably isn't proportionate. But similarly, a 2-stage, very simple process probably wouldn't be appropriate for the design and build of a hospital.
Yes.
So to run through an example of how a multi-stage process might look, you could start by publishing your tender notice, receiving and assessing requests to participate, shortlist those suppliers, and then notify them. So that would be stage 1. Stage 2 would then be to issue your ITT to those selected suppliers, receive tenders from them, assess those tenders, shortlist suppliers following that, and then invite the shortlisted suppliers to the next stage. This could then be a presentation stage so that you then view and assess those presentations. And then finally, from all of that information, you notify the suppliers and issue assessment summaries, publish your contract award notices, commence a standstill, and then award the contract. And that's actually a relatively simple example of a multi-stage process. If you go on government guidance, there are far more extreme examples of just how detailed you can get. But essentially, what authority can do is build a process which best fits their objectives, the local needs, and also the nature of the market in which they're operating, all as long as the tender notice and associated documents clearly set out what they're going to do. And then, of course, they follow it.
Yes.
So that's where they are.
So just thinking about that, where contracting authorities and suppliers might have been worried that they've all got to learn new processes.
Yeah.
Actually, what you're saying is you can continue to use things that you're familiar with.
Absolutely.
Suppliers will probably see a lot of things they're familiar with. They might just be packaged slightly differently, and they're now called something different.
Absolutely. So you could still run a competitive procedure with negotiation. The difference is you'd call it a competitive flexible procedure.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's just under a different name.
Understood. That's really interesting. Okay, so we've talked about the open and the competitive flexible procedures. Yeah. You also mentioned direct award.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this because actually fundamentally they're very similar to how they always were. As we mentioned in the Key Changes podcast, the big change really is that there is now a chapter dedicated to direct award, whereas previously we had Regulations 32. And broadly, the justifications are the same as they always were. So, for example, you still make a direct award for a production of a prototype or a unique piece of art. You can still do a direct award where competition is absent due to technical reasons, intellectual property, etc., etc. But there are a couple of changes. The first is that the justification of urgency remains, albeit with one fairly significant caveat, which is that if that urgency is brought about by the actions of the contracting authority, and it was foreseeable that that would cause the urgency, you can't rely on this particular exemption, or justification. Now, we chatted about this a little bit earlier, and it's kind of always been the case, or it's always been implied within the Act or within the regs, but it's now explicit. If you cause that urgency to come about, you can't rely on that justification. There's also a change to the justification for goods, services, works, where it's a repeat contract following the expiration of a previously tendered award. You can now make a direct award if it's within the last 5 years, albeit the intention to make that direct award at the expiry of that 5-year term has to be included in the tender notice and documentation. So it sort of gives with one hand and takes away with the other. You've got to plan it at the point at which you award the initial contract. There's also a new justification of direct award to protect life. Clearly comes from COVID.
Yes.
But you can only rely on that justification when the Secretary of State publishes specific regulations allowing you to do so.
All this talk about COVID and urgency reminds me of all those contracts that the Secretary of State for Health let during COVID for PPE and things like that.
Absolutely.
Presumably relying on the urgency exemption.
Yes.
And what you're saying now is that's still there with a few changes and is actually now in a section specifically called direct award. Which is what I think we all kind of called it anyway as shorthand. Yeah, it's recognised that's what it is.
Absolutely.
Very interesting. So moving on then, what's new in the world of frameworks?
Okay, I think we can fairly quickly deal with standard frameworks. Broadly, these remain the same as they always have been. There are a few changes. First is that there's now an implied term within every framework that allows an authority to exclude a supplier from participating in any selection process under that framework if they are an excluded supplier or they have become an excluded supplier since the framework was awarded. There's also various transparency requirements which need to be followed. Again, we'll cover this in a different podcast dealing with notices and transparency. And finally, either of the competitive tendering processes can now be used to set up the framework. So yeah, it's always fundamentally been thus, but that's the way you now procure.
Understood. So you talked there about what you called standard frameworks. That's because I heard there's this new concept called an open framework. Is that right?
There is indeed. I think this is one of the big changes that's been brought in by the Act. A lot of people are interested in what they are and how they operate. The idea is that they're going to provide authorities with the opportunity to reassess the market and refresh their supplier base to react to market changes. And they also give additional suppliers opportunities to join established frameworks. This is intended, I think, to promote value for money and better competition. If I were to sit here and completely oversimplify what an open framework is, I'd describe it as a framework which is set up for a maximum of 8 years, which then effectively operates as a series of frameworks which are reopened or re-procured on substantially the same terms during that term.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you for the simplification, but I think we do need a bit more detail, don't we?
Yeah, that's probably quite right, to be fair. It's a new concept, so yeah, that's a shit. Yeah. Okay, so your initial step to establishing an open framework is very similar to a standard framework in that you use either of the competitive tendering procedures. And most of the standard framework rules apply. For example, it must set out the scope of goods, services, or works to be provided and use lots if appropriate. Also set out the selection processes to be used when awarding contracts under it. There's also no limit to the number of suppliers that may be admitted, though an authority may impose a limit if it wants to, but there must be a minimum of 2 suppliers on an open framework for it to remain an open framework. If you end up with a single supplier framework, it reverts to a standard framework.
Oh, right. That's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's explicit within the Act. Again, you would have a maximum term of 4 years at that point, of course. As I mentioned above, they effectively operate as a series of frameworks awarded for a maximum period of 8 total years, but they're re-procured or opened on predetermined intervals throughout the lifetime of that 8 years. And they have to be opened up at least once following the initial term, which is 3 years. So the way they work is you have an 8-year term maximum. The first term can only run to a maximum of 3 years and has to be opened up during that term. Following that term, For the remaining, however more, it has to be opened up another single time at least to allow new suppliers to tender to replace on the framework.
Understood.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, for example, for us to set up an open framework with an overarching term of 8 years, the initial framework or initial term running for 2 years, and then following that term, be opened up every 2 years. So, if it was awarded today, the first would run to January 2027. Then you'd have the next to January 29, third to January 2031, and the final one to January 2033, sorry. Yeah. So with that example, use fixed term for the initial framework. An authority could also design that initial framework to be awarded for 1 or 2 years with an optional extension. So, but that's only up to the maximum of 3 years. So let's go back to that. I know there's a lot to take in.
Oh, yeah.
So let's go back to that first example that we started today, but the initial term, rather than being 2 years, is 1 year, but with 2 optional extensions on top of that, a year. So at the end of that first year, we decide the market hasn't changed enough. So we extend for a further year. So then it still ends in January 2027. At the point at which we're coming up to the end of that second year, we think, actually, the market has changed. Let's open it up. So that option to extend falls away, and it operates exactly the same way as the previous example we set up.
Right, I'm with you. Gosh, so if you're thinking, if your client sees a commercial justification in having an open framework,
yes,
that's one thing, but then they've got to decide how they see it working.
Absolutely.
And they need to decide at the start, from the sounds of what you're saying, as to what sort of options they want to go down in terms of that reopening, that re-procurement.
That's absolutely right.
Right. And see, you can get lots of variations.
It's going to be really interesting to see how they operate in practice. The final thing I will say about them as well is that each framework in the scheme, so each framework in an open framework, must expire before the next one's awarded. It won't prevent ongoing selection processes continuing for the award under the previous framework. However, as soon as it expires, no further awards can be awarded on that framework, and it must be on the next one within that series. It seems obvious,
yes,
but it is a clear distinction.
But clearly, under any framework, you can call off at any time up to the point the framework expires. But once the framework expires, you can't do it. What the difference here is that framework's going to be replaced by another one.
Exactly.
So it could be that it's fairly seamless. Yes, people might not notice the difference potentially, but you might have different suppliers for the next set of call-offs, which brings me to my next point, which is if you are a supplier who gets onto the framework initially, let's call it framework 1
Absolutely.
of this series of frameworks, are you guaranteed to be able to get on the later frameworks actually procured?
No, you're not. Depending on the type of open framework, suppliers who are on the framework may get a choice as to whether to put in a new tender or just rely on their original tender. But either way, they're going to be reevaluated with all the other bidders. So there's no guarantee that they'll stay on that framework.
Interesting. Or even if they do, they might be ranked differently. If ranking is important in the operation of that framework. So
You're absolutely right.
So I can see the pros and cons of open frameworks here. And I can see how suppliers might think, great, I'm not locked out of that market for the whole length of the framework. I've got options to get back in. But if I'm on it, I'm also not locked in for longer than whatever the period of that mini framework, if you like, is. So interesting. Okay. Okay. So when a framework is opened up or re-procured in the series of frameworks, can you modify the framework each time?
Yes and no, just to sit on that further. Thanks. Yes. So the new frameworks must be awarded on substantially the same terms. And so in practice, it's likely that the terms will remain the same. But the benefit is that new suppliers may have emerged or existing suppliers who missed out initially may now qualify. As for how successful open frameworks will they going to be? Again, as I mentioned earlier, we're just going to have to wait and see how they work in practice. But I understand it's quite a bit of interest in the market.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure there will be. I can see some of the advantages. So that was interesting prospect. Okay, so that was frameworks and open frameworks.
Yeah.
I think that leaves us with dynamic markets, which you mentioned right at the start. So, just is a dynamic market just a dynamic purchasing system with a name change? Is that what it is?
No, they're not. They do replace DPSs, which, as I mentioned earlier, has to all terminate, and no new ones can be created after February 2029. Sorry, they must all terminate by 2029. But they are different things. The way that dynamic markets operate is even more like supplier lists than DPSs did, in that to award a contract under a dynamic market, the authority must use the competitive flexible procedure. Doesn't have an option.
Like basically the full-blown procedure.
Absolutely.
All the notices and
everything. Yeah. Right. Direct awards aren't permitted under dynamic markets. They can be divided into different categories or parts, as long as these are described so as to be easily identified by authorities and suppliers. So, for example, by reference to geographical areas. So there could be the Newcastle dynamic market and then another one for Gateshead. It would seem a little bit daft, but you could do that. There's also no minimal maximum term for a dynamic market mandated by the Act. So therefore, authorities need to consider whether there's a benefit to setting a minimum or a maximum term, and that the effect that might have on the flexibility of the dynamic and attractiveness even of the dynamic market. Dynamic markets may be modified subject to human objectives, and modifications which may be include as to how the dynamic market will operate, the categories of goods, services, works under the dynamic market, and which authorities may award contracts by reference to the dynamic market. Changes must not be made to the condition of membership at any point during the life of the dynamic market. I suspect that the change that will be viewed most importantly by authorities is the fact that dynamic markets are only allowed for covered procurements. So, fairly common practice of using DPSs for taxis and building supplies and things like that will no longer be able to be used, or any other low-value goods, services, and works, for example. And that explains why we're seeing quite a lot of DPS extended to the maximum point. Sorry?
So I was just going to say, just to be clear, when you say covered procurement there, you mean in terms of the threshold?
Absolutely.
So the dynamic markets only apply to procurements above threshold.
Yeah.
Whereas I think you're right. I think a lot of people listening to us will know that dynamic purchases are used a lot for smaller purchases. Yeah, right. I just wanted to be absolutely clear on that. That feels like a really big point.
I think it is. I think there's a bit of consternation in the market about that. It remains to be seen whether a solution to this problem is going to be created. I can only imagine it will be. But again, we'll just have to wait and see. Other examples of changes include that suppliers may submit applications for membership, and authorities must assess those applications at any time during the life of the dynamic market. The number of suppliers within the dynamic market can't be limited by the authority. And also fees may be charged to suppliers who are awarded contracts by reference to the dynamic market.
Right.
Finally, suppliers I know we're nearly there, Tim. Suppliers on a dynamic market may be reassessed at any time during the term. This might be to assess whether they still meet conditions of membership, or check whether they're on the debarment list or they're excluded and or excludable status. Authorities must remove any suppliers who are added to the debarment list on a mandatory exclusion ground after joining the dynamic market. They've got no choice, no discretion. They have to do it. Yeah. Authorities do have a discretion as to whether to remove suppliers who either they consider to be excluded but are not on the debarment list, who are now excludable after joining the dynamic market, no longer meet the conditions of membership, or who were an excludable supplier when joining, but the authority was not aware.
Right.
Yeah. Again, there's a lot of things that authorities need to be regularly aware of. at all times during the dynamic market.
So there's going to be quite a duty on authorities to make sure information is kept up to date.
Absolutely.
And usually you can impose a duty on the suppliers to provide that updated information.
Yes,
In the terms of the dynamic market.
exactly right. But ultimately, it's still on the authority. Sorry. Yeah. And then finally, much like open frameworks, we're going to learn a lot about dynamic markets, I suspect, in the next couple of years. We just need to start using them.
Yes. No, I agree. With a lot of things in the Procurement Act, my view is we need to get on and start actually applying it.
Yeah.
And see what happens. And interestingly enough, I think some of the things we talked about in this session, some of the things we don't need to be too worried about because they feel like they're not that different to what people have been used to. They're just reclassified. But you ended up there talking about an open framework, which is quite an interesting concept, lots of variations, and a dynamic market, which is actually quite different to something we've seen before. So, yes, well, let's see how we get to. Thank you very much. Actually, that's been very helpful.
Very welcome to.